So, welcome to CoCo Conversations. This is the 5th online conversation we organize, and we do so to highlight and draw attention to fascinating and cutting-edge research published with the journal Cooperation and Conflict. And today we're here to discuss the newly published article, Statehood and Recognition in World Politics, Towards a Critical Agenda, authored by my friend and famous colleague, Gëzim Visoka, who has joined me here from Ireland. And from the Netherlands, we have invited Professor Rebecca Bryant, welcome, and Professor Tanja Aalberts as commentators to give their views on statehood and recognition and to discuss Gëzim's article with him. But I should properly introduce the contributors to this CoCo Conversations. First of all, we have Dr. Gëzim Visoka, who is Associate Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Dublin City University, Ireland. His research expertise is on state recognition, peace building, and international critical theory. He is indeed a prolific writer, and some of his recent books include the Oxford Handbook of Peace Building, State Building, and Peace Formation with Oliver Richmond, published with Oxford University Press. He has also published Normalization in World Politics with Nicolas Lemay-Herbert, published with University of Michigan Press, and the Routledge Handbook on State Recognition, together with John Doyle and Edward Newman, with Routledge, and also the monograph Acting Like a State, Kosovo and the Everyday Making of Statehood. And these are only a few of his many publications. He has published book chapters and numerous articles, so he is indeed a prolific writer. Joining me from the Netherlands, we have Professor Rebecca Bryant. Welcome again. She is Professor of Cultural Anthropology at Utrecht University, and she's also the visiting professor in the European Institute at the London School of Economics. She's political and legal anthropologist whose work concerns unrecognized states, ethnic conflict and resolution, borders and bordering, and forced migration. And her primary focus is Cyprus and Turkey. Among her many publications are, most recently, Sovereignty Suspended, Building the So-Called State, co-authored with Mette Hettai at University of Penn Press, and The Everyday Lives of Sovereignty, Political Imagination Beyond the State, co-edited with Madeleine Reeves, and published with Cornell University Press. And last but not least is Professor Tanja Aalberts. Warmly welcome. She holds a chair in law and politics at the Faculty of Law at the University of Amsterdam. And she has an interest in political legal practices of global governance. And she works at the intersection of IR, international law, and international political sociology. She's co-author of The Changing Practices of International Law, published with Cambridge University Press. And she has co-edited The Power of Legality, Practices of International Law and Their Politics, also with Cambridge University Press. And her current research focuses on transnational legal encounters, colonial treaty making, and rituals of world politics. So I'm very proud to have three such important scholars joining CoCo Conversations. All three of you, warmly welcome. And my name is Annika Björkdahl, and I'm Professor of Political Science at Lund University. And I have been the editor-in-chief of Cooperation and Conflict for the last 7 years. And this is one of our initiatives that we are very proud of. And we're looking forward to an engaging conversation with three scholars here. But maybe I should just briefly begin and then leave the floor to the commentators. This important article that we're to discuss, Statehood and Recognition in World Politics Towards a Critical Research Agenda, It proposes that future research on state recognition should focus on exposing politics of knowledge and positionality, seek epistemic justice and decolonization of state recognition studies, and also it should focus on recognitionality techniques. And I think this concept, recognitionality, is a concept that Gëzim Visoka has coined himself. And I would like to start by asking you, Gëzim, what are your own personal intellectual trajectories that has led you to write this article in particular?
Thanks, Annika, and thanks again for organizing this conversation. Basically, my general interests lie sort of between two fields: peace and conflict studies and statehood and sovereignty, broadly defined. This sort of interest emanates from my sort of personal background and origins coming from Kosovo, and sort of growing up in a country that has gone through so many changes, that has had such a profound impact on theorizing, but also being theorized in regards to sort of, various concepts and issues in world politics. So that's kind of, the broader intellectual and personal sort of origins of this article, but also an interest in the topic sort of emanate from the sort of puzzling understanding of sort of where do states come from, how do they become states, and what are the sort of the challenges for becoming recognized states. Then beyond this, sort of my interest has kind of lied on traditional critical traditions of and ways of thinking about world politics. Sort of from my early studies, I was not comfortable with sort of mainstream and sort of established understanding of world politics. So I've kind of constantly sort of found myself interested on critical perspectives on broad range of concepts, theories, and debates. In terms of the sort of the article and its origins and sort of trajectories, my starting point thinking about this topic has been sort of the book Acting Like a State, which sort of has been an attempt to inductively and deductively sort of see how the world has shaped Kosovo, but how Kosovo has shaped the world when it comes sort of precisely to the question of state becoming, recognition, and its existence in that sort of liminal state of affairs. And there, sort of, I was very uncomfortable with existing views, and I couldn't really find sort of, myself, but also explanations in existing accounts. So that kind of pushed me to sort of bring together a couple of concepts, disciplines, and views on the subject. So then I kind of, conceptualized the state becoming through the lenses of diplomatic agency, performativity, and entanglements. Then later, I kind of realized that there's others who do that. Annika, you've been doing that, sort of looking at spaces, agency, and sort of, connectivity. Fiona McConnell has sort of similarly look at sort of similar concepts. So kind of, realizing that there's actually an alternative view of the world, and also Rebecca's work on various aspects of statehood and sovereignty has had an important impact. So that's kind of, the starting point. Parallel to my research interest on state recognition, I'm also sort of, active in the critical peace and conflict studies, sort of a scholarly community, mostly on sort of critical peace building views. And there, I noted that there was kind of a more advanced debate when it comes to the critical perspectives to peace building, state building, and intervention. Sort of debate much more sort of advanced, emancipated, and really more critical than in the other field of interest. So in a way, sort of I was active in both research programs, but then in one side I could see that it was really sort of behind and embedded in the state recognition one, conservative views, whereas the one on peace and conflict studies, much more diverse, interdisciplinary, and sort of, progressive. And that's kind of, to conclude this point, this kind of, all of this came together when I edited the Routledge Handbook of State Recognition, where I wanted to really kind of design that handbook and make it as sort of an intellectual space where all various views, perspectives, and sort of debates on state recognition will come together. So that gave me a chance to sort of survey and also identify what was present and absent in scholarly debate. And definitely, I could see that there was no critical sort of research agenda or sort of advanced knowledge that was brought together. Obviously, I'm not saying that there is no critical research, but it's there, it's scattered, and it is across various disciplines. So sort of the effort with the article, which hopefully will be able to sort of unpack further, it sort of originates from these sort of various trajectories, personal, intellectual, and sort of cross-cutting issues.
Thank you, Gëzim, for framing the article and for sharing with us where you come from when it comes to approaching this topic. And I find it really, really fascinating. And if you were to just briefly say something, what you think is the main contribution of this article in relation to your previous research, what would that be, you think?
So the article is sort of an invitation to kind of hopefully start a critical conversation on state recognition. So it's kind of a preliminary statement, half-baked ideas, sort of often provocative, and sort of the purpose is to sort of just move the debate forward. We know that it has been stuck for decades, and it's has been stuck in circular rounds. So that's kind of the effort. Hopefully, it will pay off by sort of inviting sort of reactions and sort of promoting new critical thinking. More precisely, what I've tried to do in this article is expose that existing thinking and ways of understanding state recognition is always for someone and for some purpose, if I can borrow Robert Cox's sort of phrase. So the sort of just highlight that the knowledge on state recognition is not objective. It comes from particular positionalities, understandings, and sort of commitments, and also open up the debate and hopefully move beyond Eurocentric scholarship and existing conservative viewpoints to kind of open up a new pathways, alternative views, and heuristics for making sense of this really important topic, which I think it's essential to understanding war and peace, change and continuity, and all major themes of war politics. And most importantly, it is an attempt to really sort of provide an intellectual pathway and also empower local voices, scholars in conflict, in recognition-seeking states. So it's an attempt to sort of maybe promote epistemic justice, sort of open up the debate and give sort of encourage scholars from these states to join these global scholarly debates and shape the discourse and understandings, because they're the one who have lived and are living these experiences, sort of entrapments, and they are often not part of these conversations. And finally, hopefully move from intellectual sort of debates, but also move forward them, but also sort of open up new policy thinking. Sort of myself, I am embedded in the kind of conviction of critique with alternativity, or with alternative. Sort of, yes, we have to criticize, practices, but critique without an alternative change and practical commitment is insufficient. So, so the idea here is hopefully, use this critical conversation as a starting point to seek new ways of regulating state recognition in the international system, or finding ways of sort of legislating it, which hopefully Tanja will kind of contribute to the conversation on that regard. So we need to unpack, de-essentialize, denaturalize existing knowledge, so that we can repack or organize in a new way that might be a more reality adequate. What Norbert Elias usually sort of talks about. It's about sort of really bringing the existing scholarship to reality, which is, I think, far behind. And then final point in terms of sort of how it relates to the other topics. In a way, this article is also my own research agenda for a couple of years. I'm working at the moment on the recognition of states, sort of as a practice itself. which kind of it's opening up my sort of views and perspectives on how post-colonial states, who themselves have struggled for recognition, now have become embedded and reproducers of this the entire discourse of exclusion, using recognition, derecognition as foreign policy tool, which in cases such as Taiwan, Western Sahara, Kosovo, and Abkhazia and South Ossetia has proven to be a quite destabilizing force. So that's kind of, it's helping me sort of, even kind of critically engage with post-colonial states and sort of expose that sort of the idea of decolonization is not enough. We have to go beyond that. And in the article, I talk about that sort of the suppressed peoples are not anymore post-colonial states or subjects, but actually a category of in between, sort of the unrecognized or partially recognized states, especially the citizens of these entities, and sort of kind of put emphasis there. And then the other sort of project I'm working at the moment is understanding how regional organizations shape state recognition practices. For example, EU and other organizations, how do they legislate, how they are sort of gatekeepers as well as sort of promoters of new norms with regard to recognition. So yeah, I'll leave it there, and yeah.
Thank you. I'm sure we will have more full explanations and so on. I'm really happy that the CoCo Conversations can provide this space for a critical conversation on statehood, state building, state making, and I'm sure your agenda for future research has provoked some ideas, thoughts, comments with Rebecca and Tanja. So I will leave the floor first to Rebecca, and we'd like to hear some of your ideas that has been provoked by this.
Okay, thank you very much. And of course, I have a lot of things that I want to say and ask, but I will try to limit myself. So if I do go on too long, please let me know, Annika. So Gëzim, I just want to thank you for writing this really important article. And I want to say that when I first started working on unrecognized states, one of the things that I really noticed was that important social theorists like Axel Honneth or Charles Taylor or Sheila bin Habib, Judith Butler, Patchen Markle, and so on, they were writing about recognition in ways that, from my perspective as an anthropologist, seemed really to apply recognition that we're seeking, but there seemed to be a refusal to apply this literature. So it was almost like what you're calling an epistemic injustice, but you might call it epistemic gap here, where there was this literature on the one hand about recognition written by social theorists, recognition as it applies to individuals or to groups, but this was not being applied to unrecognized states, and that very gap, or the reason for that gap, seemed to me to be an important part of the reason that recognition itself was not being discussed in the way that you're discussing it in your article. Okay, so I'll come back to this later, but I just wanted to say this at the beginning because it's something that has been nagging at me for years, and something that has always been in the back of my mind as I was thinking through my own research. So, I mean, the discussion that you open up is a really much needed one, and I particularly appreciate your point that the literature on state recognition needs to be freed from positivist chains, right? And also your, I think, really long overdue call, not long overdue from you, but I mean in the literature and in discipline, for decolonizing the practice of granting or withholding recognition. And I also want to note that I find it a brave argument because you could easily be accused of supporting secessionism or justifying violence or just plain being state-centric, as you note yourself in the article. So while I couldn't agree with you more about the need for this critical and decolonizing perspective on recognition, I want to challenge you a bit on what you lay out as the way forward. And I'm going to focus mainly on two issues: the relationship between violence and epistemic erasure, and the relationship between the local and the international in what you call recognitionality. So I'll start first with epistemic erasure. I'm calling it erasure because that's actually interesting, the way that I've been writing about it, and because I'm looking at it, of course, from an anthropological perspective, an ethnographic perspective, where people describe themselves as essentially being invisible, not seen, erased. Okay, so but this is obviously not a real erasure. I mean, it is an epistemic erasure. It's a refusal to see. I mean, it's seeing but refusing to acknowledge, refusing to see, or pretending like it isn't there. So I'm really appreciative of the way that you discuss throughout the article, epistemic injustice, or what you call, I think, in a really spot on phrase, epistemic alarmism. And I really like that phrase because I think it accurately summarizes the surprising submission of many academics to really arbitrary taboos on seeing or knowing or describing or researching unrecognized entities. And even those researchers who aren't, as you put it, acting as fanatical defenders of the international legal order, right, are too often really cowed by the power of hegemonic discourses surrounding these entities, making it impossible to discuss them without simultaneously expressing one's disapproval of them, or in other words, submitting to their epistemic erasure. So in other words, always having to put the names of these entities in quotation marks, right? Or put in front of them something like so-called or de facto, etc. Now, I can't speak for scholars in other disciplines, but I'll say that one of the main and lasting conundrums for those of us working on non-recognition from the ground up is the question of violence. And so here I want to ask a question that relates to this problem of epistemic erasure, because even if we were to argue that a peremptory norm, right, that territory can't validly be acquired through unlawful use of force, okay, is some kind of colonial holdover. We are at the very least taking sides in ongoing conflict,
Rebecca,
or at the worst,
repeat that
justifying
again?
ethnic cleansing. Oh, sure. So so even if we argue, right, that this peremptory norm about territory, not being, that it can't be validly acquired through unlawful force, right, and say that this is essentially a colonial holdover, how do we as scholars address the charge that we are, at the very least taking sides in an ongoing conflict, or at the worst justifying ethnic cleansing and the appropriation of property, if we challenge the norms of non-recognition that actually follow from such a peremptory norm? Yeah. So, in other words, how can we remain essentially state-centric without needing to resort to some relativist argument about all states being established through violence? Okay. So this is where I'm coming to my question about your attempt to get around the charge that you might be state-centric. Okay. So you suggest that one way around all of this is to review recognition not as an either or proposition, but as a set of practices or performances. Or this at least is how I understand what you're calling recognitionality, which, by the way, is a tongue twister of a word. And you use that word to describe the realities rather than just the discourses of recognition, okay, or rather than just the one-off, act of recognizing. Because on the one hand, you want to challenge the colonial practices of recognition that define the international order today. But then with the concept of recognitionality, you seem to water this down a bit by basically saying, well, there's lots of tacit recognition already going on, so we shouldn't think that recognition is only about one act. And I should say that this does make it seem a bit like recognitionality in your discussion is kind of equivalent to what parent states would call tacit recognition or creeping recognition. Yeah. So I think that there is an acknowledgement that this is going on all the time, right? But it's something that's always resisted by the parent states, of course, and other actors in the international community. So apart from that, though, you know, while I can sympathize with the idea that we should look at what people do rather than only what they say, okay, I want to suggest that this only acknowledges something that we all already know, while actually not solving the dilemma for people living in these epistemic black holes, you know, that are defined by non-recognition. You know, indeed, I would say that the problem with what you call recognitionality, not solving many of the recognition issues for citizens of de facto states was really a kind of starting point for the book that Mete Hatay and I published last year, because that concerns de facto state building, you know, specifically in the context of North Cyprus, which is one of the de facto states that has a pretty high degree of recognitionality. Okay, but you know, what we found though is that this recognitionality actually, in some ways, creates more problems than it solves. Something that we sort of summarize in the book through this a phrase that we use, the paradox of the de facto, where, you know, we use the phrase to emphasize that unlike in, you know, I think parts of the IR literature about such entities, you know, we don't really need to go around trying to define criteria that tell us whether these are states or not states, but rather, you know, the very fact that we call them this already indicates that they are something real, yeah. But at the very moment that we acknowledge it, we also say that we're denying that reality. So, so this paradox that's implicit in the ways that these states are dealt with from the beginning creates almost a nested box of contradictions and paradoxes in everyday life. And ultimately, okay, what we came to, and I just wonder sort of what you think about this, and I think that what I'm about to say leads into maybe what Tanja will discuss. I'm not sure, but I can guess because she's written on this. Okay, is that, you know, in this particular case, I mean, and in other cases also that I've looked at, that so often people were trapped in the language, okay, when what they were really looking for was what we could call sovereign agency, okay. And there's this big literature to which Tanja has also contributed on sovereign agency that points out, of course, that really being able to have that a kind of agency where one can do what one wants when one wants it is something that's not really achievable and is a form of misrecognition. But you know, we suggest that there's something really particular about the misrecognition that applies to unrecognized states, where in order to become agents, they're constantly in the process, in the situation of having to deny their own, the very entity that would give them should give them agency. So now I won't go into more of that, but any more about that right now, if you're interested. I mean, we could talk about it, but I just want to sort of bring that into the discussion because I think that it also gets us to maybe a point of being able to talk a bit more about the problem that you kind of sort of detour around, which is this issue of state centrism, and how we can really deal with that in creating a critical theory of recognition, especially since I mean, I would argue a lot of the language of state sovereignty may actually be misplaced in terms of what people are actually looking for, in terms of what people, you know, actually want on the ground. So I just want to bring that in again, and I'll just as a final note say that there is an interesting literature that's been developing in anthropology on refusal, which I think is actually quite relevant here in the sense that it's about the ways in which people, I mean, the literature specifically emerges out of the First Nations in the US and Canada, and how they, in everyday practices, attempt to refuse the sovereignty of the states in which they live. So there are, so this is an attempt to go beyond the state sovereignty conundrum altogether. And I've taken up too much time, so I'm going to stop there. But thank you again for the article.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Really interesting reflections. And I'm sure that we are going to get an interesting response from Gëzim, and then we'll leave over to Tanja.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks very much. I appreciate your reflections and also feedback, and also for very difficult questions, which I thought about them in the article. I have addressed them partially, but not entirely, and perhaps there are good reasons for that. With regard to sort of the question of violence and epistemic erasure, you're right. It's a really sort of tricky issue, and we as scholars sort of we, especially in the critical branches, we acknowledge that knowledge is not objective. You have to take a position. It's messy, and whatever you say can have implications in the real world. So certainly, in the article, I sort of argue that we should critically engage with sort of the questions on the foundations and origins of these recognition-seeking states, and not sort of whitewash the origins themselves. However, if we only focus on that debate, on whether sort of on what basis they've come to their existence, we end up reproducing the existing conservative order. So maybe we should leave that question for those who have been debating on this matter for decades. Because if we just focus on that sort of normative questions of who has the right and under what conditions to create a state, that might come maybe at the end of our critical conversation and attempt to redefine and revision the entire debate. So if we bring that first, there's a risk that we just entrap ourselves and we, again, close the conversation and we can't go anywhere. And certainly, what the whole idea of opening up the epistemic avenues and ways of thinking is to kind of really unpack that sort of perspective, sort of in terms of the criteria, foundations of these states, and not justify violence, but perhaps explain often why violence as a means of state creation ends up being the sort of the one that is favored by parties. So there's a question to discuss the emerging ethics of violence as last resort response. So in a way, there's a case to unpack why can't secession or self-state creation sort of undergo through peaceful means? What are the blockages in early stage? So obviously, we can go back and discuss normatively the sort of the entrapments that international law and existing state system has on state self-determination and who is entitled to that. Obviously, we can go back and then discuss constitutional national arrangements on who has the right and who is sort of in charge of deciding on sort of political fate of a particular region and state. So there's a case to problematize the pre-secession or pre-state creation dynamics critically, and sort of expose the blockages that sort of prevent peaceful either coexistence within a territorial state or separation of states. The other attempt that I try to do in early sort of stage is to normalize and actually sort of sort of the fragmentation of political cartography or state formation. Sort of historically, we've seen various waves of state formation, and as such, they've all have been violent one way or another. It's not that we should justify that or accept as such as a norm, but if we reimagine the way how the world is organized in terms of political units and maybe create normative thinking. I mean, there was an early attempt in the liberal political theory that sort of actually laid really good foundations on self-determination, that it has been absolutely suppressed and ignored by scholars in international law, political theory, IR, and never mind political science, or those that kind of take more policy view. So, in terms of the sort of preemptory norms, it's there. I addressed partially, but it is something that needs to be sort of expanded. And I think the purpose of critical research program on state recognition should not whitewash or accept as a practice, but it should interrogate, examine, and look at its origins and its implications. So in a way, you can take a partially normative view on the matter, but if you take a hardcore normative view, then you just completely misrecognize or block other aspects. In terms of the recognitionality concept, and then at the same time, you have also worked on the sort of the concept of being recognizable and sort of similar sort of practices. What I'm trying to convey with that is an overarching concept to capture a vast amount of practices, performances, steps, scales that are examined partially in scholarly work. They are very present in practice, but we don't really have a kind of consolidated understanding of them. So Foucault's concept of governmentality, I thought it's kind of good mirroring a view to look at the entire regime of practices, discourses, performances, and entangled relations that sustain the existing state-centric order, but also enable this sort of the existence of the dark side of the world society, sort of a second-order states. So that concept and sort of the idea of revisioning state recognition is to not necessarily take a position on this matter, but sort of pluralize our ways of thinking and understanding state recognition. So that's the whole idea. It's to kind of sort of expose various discourses that are not examined, various scales, agencies that you, Rebecca, do very well in your recent work. Sort of highlight sort of experienced aspects, but also the sort of micropolitics of the entire sort of understanding, living, experiencing sort of the presence and absence of recognition. And completely sort of take the point that maybe the whole idea of a regime of recognitionality might create more problems than solve it. But I think the idea there was not that we should use it as a heuristic to sort of enclose and the whole conversation, but it was to open up and sort of look at from various perspectives critically as well. Sort of because later on you talk about the refusal, and something that we often underestimate is how recognized states are dependent on unrecognized states for their existence, for their performance of sovereignty, and how they need to mirror with something that they're not to justify their existence, or how partially recognized states are essential for the existence of recognized states in a way. So this dialectics. So recognitionality should be that sort of framework that sort of captures and makes sense of how interdependent are recognized states and unrecognized states, and sort of and you discuss that in your feedback as well on the entrapments of recognition. That's something as well that we should discuss, sort of how recognition is very much double-edged practice, because once you are recognized, you owe something to those who have recognized you. You have ultimately sacrificed some agency and risk becoming a satellite or sort of a vassal sort of entity of great powers. So we need to kind of problematize at what cost and how recognition really reproduces inequality among states and actually sort of enables some state centrism as well as hierarchies of state worth and status. And finally, I completely agree with sort of the idea of the refusal and and I tried towards the end kind of highlighting that sort of the dialectics of recognition. And when I wrote the article, I also engaged with post-colonial theory of recognition, which is mostly applied to indigenous peoples. It's fascinating work, anthropological work in US and Canada, which speaks about how accepting recognition by the sort of dominant or settler community is a form of obedience, form of actually losing identity and the struggle for who they are. So basically, recognition was obedience, loss of agency, and very much submission to the reality. And instead, that sort of literature points out to the need of self-recognition, which is also in line with Frantz Fanon's sort of critique and perspective on the recognition, which is something that I haven't really dealt a lot in the article, but there's a case if someone wants to develop a radical theory of recognition. The grounds for that are in post-colonial theory of indigenous peoples, as well as sort of the Fanon's work. But if you go in that path, then you just sort of screw up any possibility for any reconciliation or for a reordering the international system. So in a way, the research program, the critical sort of program that I kind of propose, the two avenues, it's really modest. It's not radical, for my taste. It's a kind of, a kind of really compromised middle way to sort of initiate a critical discussion. Hopefully over the years, people will sort of consider my view as something as sort of very sort of middle range, and then they might go to kind of more extreme views. But certainly it is an invitation for that sort of opportunity and possibility to discuss also sort of self-recognition, refusal to be recognized, and the implications of that sort of rearranging of knowing and being known to others. So I'll leave it there. I hope that didn't take too long. And I know, Rebecca, I haven't responded entirely to all of the feedback, but this is just maybe a brief response.
Your answers were great. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Gëzim, for this thought-provoking article. I think it's a very interesting, passionate, and indeed provocative contribution to unravel the problem of recognition in world politics through what you maybe can call a mismatch of politics and law. And I particularly like your call to the pluriversality and geocultural nuances of state becoming and recognition, as you formulated yourself. So the idea of investigating practices of being state-like and being recognized as an international subject in one form or another, or what I would call the production of international subjectivities. And this relates very much to the legal fiction and performativity of international personality that I've been working on myself. Now, if I read your article, to me, it seems that there's actually two agendas of the problem identification. And one is more empirical. So this idea that these different practices of recognition let's say, are not recognized by the binary conception of statehood. So either you're fully recognized as a state or you're not, and then you just don't exist. Whereas there's all these liminal practices of being recognized as, a different type of subject and engaging in practices of diplomacy, even if you're not fully recognized and don't have this full international legal personality yet. So this is, I think, what you call the calling for more reality adequate accounts, right? That actually take this variety of practices into account. And then there is a more normative agenda, and that's the lack of emancipatory justice linked to the familiar problem of the constrained self in the principle of self-determination, which is epitomized in the notion of utopossitatis that you also refer to in your article. And here you also call more generally for an ontological suspicion of the state. Now, in this context, and we might be repeating a little bit of what we have been what Rebecca was also bringing to the table, but I think it's coming from a bit of a different perspective. But I'm still a bit puzzled by your own continued focus on state recognition as a solution out of the conundrum. So to me, it seems ironic that on the one hand, you want to do away with the state and with state recognition, but you also keep putting it back on the table. So this is the first point that I would like to push you a little bit on in that sense, and maybe actually push you to where you maybe should be more radical than the middle way as you described it yourself now. But actually also in terms of both your agendas, so not just empirically, but also not just normatively, but also empirically. So my first question would be why this focus on state recognition? And also probably in light of what you mentioned in the introduction about post-colonial states and how they themselves have become very strong defenders of sovereignty and gatekeepers. Which then raises the question in terms of your normative agenda, whose justice or injustice are you focusing on? And how might this be actually undermined by a continued focus on state recognition? And then empirically, I think you're very right, and it's very much needed, this focus of or broadening of the research agenda to look at these pluriverse practices of recognition. But as I read your article, you might here be a little bit too focused on that this should be our focus instead of the current more binary understanding of recognition, because I think they actually they exist in parallel. So we have both practices. So these gatekeeping practices. So it still matters whether you're recognized as a full state or not. Well, of course, with all your expertise on Kosovo. So these are not. It's not either or, but these are like parallel worlds that exist, that both exist. And then I'm wondering if your diagnosis that the problem lies with scholarly concepts and epistemic gatekeeping might seem at least partly mismatched, because it's not as if this gatekeeping and this binary notion of recognition doesn't still also exist in practice, and if we don't have that gatekeeping. So I would say, is this a problem of the scholarly concepts? And actually, maybe underlying this, do scholarly concepts have such an impact on reality? Or is it more about a very diverse repertoire of recognition practices and their politics, and then scholarly agendas being too much state-centered, right? So not opening up to this diversity, which then brings me back to my puzzle of why do you focus on state recognition, which seems to limit the possibility to break open the agenda, both empirically and normatively. And this again is this, whether this compromise middle way, as you formulate it yourself, actually is going to help with both these agendas, or actually might middle way might not be actually the way forward. So I would also very much like to discuss your notion of recognitionality as a way out of this conundrum, but maybe, I don't know if we get a second round, so maybe so I will leave that for the second round.
Thank you, Tanja. And I'm sorry, I had some technical difficulties, so I wasn't able to give you the floor, but good thing you are such a capable group, so you managed yourself. I'm sorry about that. And now over to you, Gëzim, because this raised additional interesting and intriguing questions for you to respond to. So I give the floor to you, Gëzim.
Thanks, Tanja, very much. Again, really, really important insights. So absolutely, I share the same dilemmas, and hopefully in the article I haven't come across that I'm actually becoming part of the epistemic enclosure myself by sort of limiting on these two directions, or on a particular view of what should happen, because I think I tried to say in introduction and conclusion that there are many elements and aspects that could future directions can take as well. These are not the only ones, but this is what I thought it could be the starting point to start the conversation. But the first question is why focus on state recognition is sort of, am I reproducing the entire order? So in essence, I believe sort of by scrapping the entire reality of gatekeeping, state-centric, and sort of, binaries, we might not really have a real-world impact. So that there needs to be connection between what's the existing practices, perspectives, and hopefully sort of tap into the existing debates, open them up, bring in pluriversal and sort of, so basically my understanding, and I think the way forward is to reform the existing order, not entirely imagine an alternative, complete new one. Hopefully that would happen later, but to reform the existing order along the lines of expanding our conceptual understanding of recognition, moving beyond the binaries, recognizing these sort of practices that are in between, and then sort of seeing that sort of state practice as well follows, sort of in a sense, they might not be obsessed with recognition and non-recognition as sort of entry point in the club of sovereign states. So maybe by discussing and expanding on an understanding of recognition, we make it irrelevant and show that countries maybe don't need recognition among another. That used to be the practice before the 19th century. So we might sort of by exposing the various aspects of how countries can exist without really formal recognition, we could open up the way of reimagining the entire sort of system of state existence without really requiring recognition being used and abused as a gatekeeping practice. So sort of my view on this matter is that by pluralizing our understanding of recognition, by exposing its sort of colonial politics, by sort of emphasizing the sort of state-like features of these unrecognized or partially recognized states, we might really sort of overcome this legal doctrinal obsession with recognition that has actually infected also state practice. So I believe on the power of concepts, and for example, if you see concepts like engagement without recognition, or something in sort of sort of creative ways of ambiguity that organizations and states deal with these unrecognized states, they have started as academic concepts, some of them, and taken over by state practice. And then that they have had an impact on their sort of political existence and the work of states, or these unrecognized states. Why I advocate for recognition? Partially because, again, I'm not appearing as anti-state in the article. Actually, I make the case that state is important agent, not only of violence but also emancipation. But we should not underestimate how state can become also an agent of violence, and we've seen that in post-colonial states. And so I'm not favoring that, but I'm arguing that for many ethnic groups, regions, state becoming is the only way to achieve freedom, emancipation, and some sort of security. That new state might become, again, as the rest of the states, reproducer of violence, but it is the only aspirational framework for achieving justice, rights, and emancipation. And so if we go with the with a cosmopolitan view, trying to understand a kind of supranational arrangement of political entities, and then sort of scrap the nation state, we are absolutely underestimating around 20 million of people who live in these unrecognized states or partially recognized states, as well as aspirations of millions of other ethnic groups or groups who seek independence, because we're denying something that they perceive as the only way forward to their existence and survival as a group, be that their cultural rights and forms of expression. So that's where I come. I believe there is a way we can reconcile emancipation, freedom, justice with state. but that's another debate. You know, we have to discuss the whole kind of, you know, redesigning of the state and what's its purpose and what it can do. Now, in terms of the parallel worlds, they exist, and recognitionality is an effort to try to kind of, you know, pluralize our vocabulary, our understanding of, and sort of basically normalize these recognition-seeking states, and eventually sort of, you know, treat them as equals with the rest. You know, so that's kind of, you know, the effort there. And yeah, so in terms of the sort of the problem with scholarly concepts and debates, I completely agree. We have to redesign the entire vocabulary, the semantics, the toponymy of state recognition and its concepts related to that, and make. I mean, I highlight that in the first part of the article. I think that's part of that sort of epistemic, you know, injustice, the way how they are demonized, they're sort of how they use derogatory terms, how they're sort of, you know, absolutely denied any form of sort of recognition and the rest. So Rebecca's work, and recently we had an exchange about sort of, you know, how these concepts are really powerful, and just from the de facto language, de facto states, unrecognized states, we are reproducing really state-like conservative colonial practices by using these concepts. And that's why I try to use recognition-seeking or aspirant states, kind of more humane concepts, and not really just sort of you know, negative epistemics and negative concepts that that just kind of, you know, very much reproduces the parent or former-based states discourse. So yeah, so as part of this sort of critical agenda and directions, we need to invent a more emancipatory, inclusive, realistic language, and how we refer to these so-called states. And even the so-called is just so abusive. I think the whole kind of grammar and categories and vocabulary it's just so appalling.
Thank you. I think there is time for a round of brief comments again, and maybe we can touch upon some of the things that you have brought up again here, Gëzim. And I think it's really interesting how you push for this critical research agenda, which at the same time is actually bringing the state back in when we talk about recognition, right? So it's not a paradox perhaps, but there are certainly some tensions between your critical research agenda on recognition and the fact that it's to some extent bringing the state back in. But I think I'll leave the floor to Tanja here, and then to Rebecca to come back to you.
Yeah, so I think actually your comments now might be a nice bridge to my question about the concept of recognitionality and how that is going to help us to break open this agenda. Because if I may use I've been working also with speech act theory, and in that language, basically what you see with this recognition, and maybe as a way to also break open this, well, you call it the obsession with recognition with legal scholars. I don't think that there is an obsession with recognition, but there's an obsession with the doctrinal question, which doctrine prevails, right? So, but if you look at the declaratory doctrine, which basically says, well, you know, as soon as you declare your state, or as soon as you fulfill the empirical qualities, you are a state. But then in practice, what we see is that is just not how reality works. And this is where the politics kicks back in, right? That even if this is the formal, legally, the formal dominant doctrine, then still in reality, we see that it takes more than this declaration of independence to actually be able to perform as a state, a fully accepted state in the international community. So you're definitely a particular kind of subject, but what you aren't is a full state. So that is that gatekeeping. And I think you're also very, very right that this is producing another regime of inequality. And in my own work, I've even put this a little bit more starkly, actually, that it's not just the lack of recognition, but even also the entities that do get recognized as an equal member, that too is reproducing this the standard of civilization, you know, using Foucault's notion of governmentality. So here is my bridge then, because of course you use governmentality, or you have your own original take on governmentality to introduce this concept of recognitionality as a way out of the conundrum of recognition, as we might formulate it. Now, insofar as this concept suggests a way to look at the more pluriverse practices of recognition that we've been discussing, then I see that it can open up the empirical research agenda that you call for, right? So these this move away from the binary and to look at all this behind the scenes practices of recognition, you know, save for the full recognition. But I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how recognizability relates to governmentality as a practice of power, the way that Foucault formulated it, and this idea of the conduct of conduct. Do you see that? Is that something that's also incorporated in your concept or not? And this also relates to a question I had with a particular formulation on page 3. You say that recognition is not entirely shaped by power, legal norms, institutions, and material conditions, but also constituted through diplomatic discourse, performances, and entanglements. And from a Foucauldian perspective, I have actually difficulties in understanding this "or," because I think from a Foucauldian perspective, power, legal norms, institutions, and material conditions are nothing but constituted through discourse, performances, and entanglements. So I would like to, just some clarification how you see this. And then also, last but not least, moving back to your other more normative agenda in this article, how is, I don't quite understand yet how recognitionality is going to overcome the epistemic injustice that you put on the table. And so how is it going to help with this more normative question that you put so on the table so urgently? Thank you.
Thank you, Tanja. I think we'll let Rebecca in and then return to you, Gëzim. So Rebecca, please.
Okay, I'll try to be brief, and I'll really just make one comment and ask one question. The comment builds on what Tanja just said, the very last thing she said about recognitionality and epistemic injustice. And I think that there, you know, as I was commenting before, there are certain unrecognized states that can be used as examples for why the recognitionality does not, I told you it was a tongue twister, right? why it doesn't necessarily solve this issue, because you know, you see that certain states can have a high degree of that. In other words, they can you know, interact with all sorts of, you know, various transnational entities. Diplomats, you know, acknowledge their leaders in various ways, et cetera, et cetera. But there is still this, you know, epistemic erasure or alarmism that continues despite that. So I would just, you know, emphasize that I think there needs to be, you know, more work done on that relationship to make it a bit clearer. And then I will also want to go back to a question that Tanja asked and that you answered, where Tanja asked if scholarly concepts really have such an impact on reality. And I would say there that in fact they do in these particular cases, because, you know, I mean, we all live with what we might call everyday geopolitics, right? The points at which geopolitics enters our everyday lives and shapes our conceptions of the world around us, and especially politics around us. But I think that in these kinds of entities, that everyday geopolitics is particularly keen. People are very concerned with what's being written about them, how it's being written, and so on. And in terms of policy making, I mean, the very few scholars who work on these states have a seat at the table, right? So there's I think that there is a real relationship there between scholarly discourse and what's happening on the ground. But that then brings me to what Gëzim was saying, partly in answer to your question, where he, and also in relationship to what you were pressing him on regarding the state centrism, right? So he talked about how sort of aspiring states or state, what was it you called, sovereign seeking states, I can't remember how you expressed it, but how there is we have to take seriously those aspirations to statehood, because they imagine that this will provide them with safety, etc. But again, if we go back to the ways that scholarship shapes these realities, I would say that this then becomes a vicious circle, because actually we as scholars then end up reproducing the idea that the only answer to these problems is the state, right? And this is why I have, especially as an anthropologist, I suppose, I have tried to go back again and again to understanding what it is that people are really asking for, what it is that they're really wanting, and whether the state model is really that, or whether they're trapped in the language of stateness, right? I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I saw that Tanja was indicating that you wanted to comment on that. So please go ahead, and then Gëzim.
Well, maybe to push it a little bit stronger, because I very much think that concepts, have a worldly effect, but maybe to put it then in relation to your own proposed concept of recognitionality, right? Do you see that this would be a concept that would actually also help on the ground in that sense with the struggles that you want to identify?
Thanks a lot. I'm going to be watching this over and over again, this recording. Okay, so Tanja, I'll start with your question, sort of unpack that you wanted me to unpack a bit further, recognitionality and its relationship to the governmentality, and sort of whether I'm not entirely highlighting the importance of norms, rules, and sort of institutions that they're very much present in Foucault's work. I'm aware of those. I have written another book on normalization and world politics, and so it's entirely drawing on Foucault's work, and I've read his work, and I think I can understand what his concept is. What I try to do with the concept of recognitionality is not see it as a prescription on how to get recognized, but have it as an epistemic concept to help us account for the conduct of recognition, the recognition and misrecognition. So it's more like an umbrella term that we can use to understand, explore a broad range of discourses, practices, conducts, misconducts, entanglements, power relations, dependencies, agencies, scales. They're more about giving us a framework to understand that recognition, or the absence of it, is a powerful device. It is used for political and powerful interests. So it has agency in itself as a practice, but also as a concept. And take that seriously to kind of understand how it is practiced and manifested in practice. By looking at discourses, performances, and entanglements, I think recognitionality as a concept it will give us you know, a possibility to look at how recognition-seeking states actually resist existing order and how they're transforming it beyond what we actually are recognizing as such. In my book, Acting Like a State, I have in detail sort of documented how Kosovo has changed the rules of regional organizations, international organizations, transformed the entire sort of system of the backdoor entrance membership that has had implications on sort of the constitutional, foundational goals and constitution of these organizations. So it's about that sort of, you know, other side of how recognition-seeking states perform agency. What do they do, and how do they sort of push for recognition? So it's not necessarily taking a normative position where they should be recognized or not, but trying to understand how they push for recognition, how they coexist. And there's a broad range of practices that there is now growing research on those on kind of case-based, but there isn't anything more comprehensive. So recognitionality hopefully will be that sort of framework that will enable us as scholars to kind of, you know, pluralize our knowledge on existing practices. So enriching the empirical knowledge on this. And then that where that becomes sort of kind of normative, it is the fact that hopefully when we have a much advanced understanding of recognitionality practices, then we'll be able maybe to generate policy, legal ways of regulating its practice. Because I believe at the end of the day, there's a case for international treaty, convention, or guidelines, as well as an institutional framework that might sort of, you know, outline, say something about you know, statehood recognition, so that at least it prevents or creates sort of realistic expectations, as well as prevents abuse of this practice, either by great powers or other smaller states who utilize that as foreign policy instrument. So you know, it is a heuristic to help us understand the practice, but also hopefully generate sufficient knowledge so that we move to the sort of, you know, to sort of a more advanced normative stage. Rebecca, I was trying to take notes about the concepts, and I think there was a question about, yeah, recognitionality and epistemic injustice. How will it sort of, you know, shape and sort of have an effect? I believe by sort of, you know, highlighting various practices and generating new sort of, you know, alternative views of how we see recognition, and by bringing in scholars and voices from recognition-seeking states, we might sort of, you know, generate some epistemic justice in the sense of give some sort of fair share in the debates. I'm trying that to do with, I did a new book series called Relative Studies in Statehood, and I've received sort of manuscripts from scholars from Kurdistan, from other sort of, you know, regions of the world, who have sort of found inspiration on the sort of critical work and want to kind of, you know, reveal and show how, you know, wannabe states or regions actually are performing sort of state-like practices, are seeking various forms of recognition, are already sort of implicated in this recognitionality regime globally. So by sort of, you know, opening the debate, hopefully, you know, we give voice to a space to alternative scholars from other regions of the world that we don't usually hear about or from.
Thank you so much. I do think that a lot of scholars will now pick up on your concept of recognitionality. I think it provides really an emancipatory space, and it can be picked up by other scholars, like you mentioned here, people whose voices we normally don't hear within this epistemic community, within which scholars of IR and international law normally move. So in that sense, it's really something that will be interesting to see how it will come to use. To me, this has been a very inspiring and engaging discussion. And I think you successfully have managed to sort of revise and unpack the borders of this debate on recognition, and also pluralize our way of thinking about statehood, state becoming, recognition or misrecognition. So this has been really, really fruitful in so many ways. And I hope that you too have enjoyed it. And I want to thank you from the whole board and editorial team of Cooperation and Conflict for taking the time and engage with us, and also for choosing Cooperation and Conflict as an outlet for your research findings. We're really proud to publish your work, Gëzim, and proud to have Rebecca and Tanja here discussing it. So many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annika and Gëzim.
Thank you very much.
The scholars from other regions of the world that we don't usually hear about or from.
Thank you so much. I do think that a lot of scholars will now pick up on your concept of recognitionality. I think it provides really an emancipatory space, and it can be picked up by other scholars, like you mentioned here, people whose voices we normally don't hear within this epistemic community, within which scholars of IR and international law normally move. So in that sense, it's really something that will be interesting to see how it will come to use. To me, this has been a very inspiring and engaging discussion. And I think you successfully have managed to sort of revise and unpack the borders of this debate on recognition, and also pluralize our way of thinking about statehood, state becoming, recognition or misrecognition. So this has been really, really fruitful in so many ways. And I hope that you too have enjoyed it. And I want to thank you from the whole board and editorial team of Cooperation and Conflict for taking the time and engage with us, and also for choosing Cooperation and Conflict as an outlet for your research findings. We're really proud to publish your work, Gëzim, and proud to have Rebecca and Tanja here discussing it. So many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annika and Gëzim.
Thank you very much.